we're going to start out by creating controllers that can be versioned. And let's see what that looks like. Here we're back at our counting case project. And the first thing I'm going to do, assuming you're following along, is let's disable security while we're in debug mode so that we can quickly iterate these so I don't have to go ahead and include user or app IDs when I'm calling my APIs. I'm going to start by going to my auth filter. And at the top, I'm just going to say if debug, because we only want this to happen in debug. I'm going to define a new disable security. Now I'm putting this inside debug so that I can have sections that are just about disabling security. I could just wrap this all in an if debug, but I find it a little easier so that I could actually disable security and release later if I absolutely had to, just to work through problems. And I'm just going to come down to our on authorization and just put a if not disable security around our entire call. This will still be registered in our project, it just won't do anything. It'll just flow through and assume that authorization has succeeded. Again, the primary motivation behind this is so that we can go ahead and work with our project without having to cruft up all of the individual security pieces every time. Should make the demo a little easier for you to do in these versioning discussions. The other quick thing I'm going to do before we talk about building our version controllers is I'm just going to go to the counting entity and do if debug else, so that in release we're still going to get that current printable, but here we're going to go back to returning my name hard-coded so that we can again be able to debug and work with our APIs in a simple way. So with all of that bookkeeping out of the way, let's make sure I can build my project. Let's talk about controllers. So we've got the set of controllers here that we talked about before, and we may or may not want to version all the controllers at once. Let's take a concrete example. If we remember, our measure controller is returning a measure model, which just includes URL, description, calories. That's the only thing it's really returning. But if we remember that the underlying measure class actually has quite a number of properties that we would like to return. So in the database, we're actually storing all of this sort of information. That would be useful for us to actually get at. To go ahead and version the measures controller. And I'm going to do this by just making a copy of the measures controller. And I could put it in a different namespace or something like that. But for our example, I'm just going to call it measures v2. Now the convention for naming this, there isn't any magic here. You can call it whatever you want. The techniques we're going to show you are going to allow you to really decide how you want to architect your projects. Don't take what I'm doing here as the right way. It is simply a way to handle this. And in our measures controller, let's go ahead and change the name of the controller itself. And we're changing the name because Web API, when it builds up the list of controllers, it expects them to all be unique regardless of namespace. Some of the other techniques out there talk about having a measures controller inside of a v1 and a v2 and a v3 namespace. That is possible, and when we get to how that's done, I'll sort of hint at how you would have to do that. But out of the box, it actually is easier if they are named differently. I'm going to keep the same functionality in this case, but instead of returning measure model, I want to actually create a new type of entity here that I'm going to call measure v2 model. I'll call the same thing here. And down in our models, let's go ahead and make a copy of the measure model to be this new version. Now, instead of just defining a whole new model here, what I'm going to actually do is derive from measure model. That way, all the data that we're using for measure model we'll use, and we'll just go ahead and add the additional pieces we want here. We want to include here, to extend the measure model, all of the different data that we could get from the database. So I'm just going to copy these from the entities into our new model. So therefore, this model will include the URL, the calories, and description, as well as all of these new pieces of nutritional information. Now that we have this new measure v2 model, we're going to have to create a new method on the model factory that knows how to generate the version. There's a lot of different ways to do this. We could call it create2. We could include a version down here. Whatever method you find most satisfactory. I'm just going to create a new method called create2 so that you can see what we want to accomplish. And we're going to return the measure model 2. And here I'll do a little editor inheritance from our measure. And we'll see here that we can't just use the other create because it's going to return the base class of what we want. There are ways to more cleverly handle that, but I'm just going to simply put and create our new measure v2 model. But in this case, we actually have quite a number of new properties now. We can see the measure2 model includes all these different pieces. Let's change this name to measure. And now we have this new model here. So if we've done this right, we now have a controller. Let's go ahead and add the support for returning the single item. That's going to include the new information. Let's make sure that we have all the little pieces. Yep. So we have a controller that's all ready to give us all the new version of our controller with the new functionality in it. Now that we have the controller, we're going to need to figure out how to differentiate which version of the API someone's going to want, the measures controller or the measures2 controller.